Welcome to Trendy Words, the podcasts about the words and phrases that are popular in business and marketing, but we often find are misleading, meaningless, or outright bullshit. And what could we be saying instead that would be more effective? My name is Andrew, copywriter and a eternally bullish person for Birmingham, and today I am joined by my guest, Sophie Blackmore. Hi, Sophie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you on here. So I've known Sophie now for it's been what, a couple of years, a
Probably,
year,
yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
something like that. So why don't we start before we get underway with today's word? You could share with listeners a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Okay, cool. So yes, my name is Sophie Blackmore and my business is Happy Marketer, which hopefully gives you a clue in the title as to what I do. I do marketing and I'm generally quite happy. But essentially, what we do at Happy Marketer is we simplify marketing success for people with very technical minds. So we are B2B, and the people that we work with the most are maxed out MDs, people who are not exclusively, but mostly engineers, software developers, manufacturers, accountants that are out of startup mode. They're profitable, they know their stuff, but they don't have in house marketing, or they have some in-house resource but not the experience to direct it, and they need some strategic and some tactical support. And what I do is I work with them to try and simplify that to help them make marketing magic within their business. So that's me in a nutshell. So we work out what people need and what they need to help deliver it.
And it feels it should be fitting, knowing that you do a lot of this work for your clients, that today's word is strategy.
Funnily enough, there's a connection there.
Yeah. So yeah, strategy for me is seen, and one of the reasons I was very happy when I talked with Sophie about presenting this was I've seen strategy used in all kinds of ways, including some ways that I don't barely understand how you could view that as strategic, and some that are I think are much more genuine. But why don't we start then with maybe some of your experiences of the more peculiar ways that you've seen strategy used?
Yeah. Okay. So um, I think it's very difficult, I think, in the business world or in any world, I suppose, that any word, when you say a word over and over or you write a word over and over, it begins to lose all meaning, right? It sort of becomes a non-word. And when it comes to strategy, people bandy it around a lot because it sounds impressive, but they don't necessarily understand what the word means. And an awful lot of the time, strategy is used instead of what they actually mean, which is, oh, it's a framework, it's a plan, it's, different types of tactics. Maybe it's a certain tool they're using, and they'll say, my strategy is X, whatever those things are. And you're like, no, those are things. They're not a strategy, So somebody might say, "Oh, I'm using social media," and it's like that's not a strategy. That's a tactic, And so many people don't necessarily understand the difference between the two, but they'll say, "My strategy is, you know, I'm on social media," or "My strategy is." I'm going to record a podcast and whatever. And actually, it's like, well, no, that's the thing you're doing. The strategy is what underpins it. And I think
Mhm.
because, I before I came to speak to you, I thought, okay, I'm going to Google what is a strategy, right? And like, there's so many different, this is what people think it is. And like, no wonder people are confused um, about what it means, like, because actually there isn't necessarily a very clear definition that people can understand or understand how to create one and apply one themselves, which is ultimately what you would need a strategy for,
Mm.
is to enable you to do something, right?
Yeah, I certainly, you reminded me of this earlier this week. I've deliberately suppressed where I saw it, but on LinkedIn, I saw a post that very aggressively expressed this idea that the strategy is the opposite of a plan, and then did like a compare and contrast. And it made me so unreasonably angry because it was so incredibly misleading and so much seemed like somebody basically just put a bunch of words on the page that sounded clever and put them out there. And the worst part is that most other people don't bother reading it properly or thinking hard about like, that doesn't actually make sense.
Mm.
Because I think in a light, because so many people don't really understand what they think of as strategy, so they end up getting easily taken in by people that say this is definitely what a strategy is.
Oh yeah, it's supremely unhelpful, and it makes me mad too.
Yeah. So I wrote down mostly sort of, yeah, I think a little bit of mirrored what you're just. Strategy isn't tactics. It's not a plan. It's not really a framework. It's not a mindset. So maybe at this point, there's a beginning of what for you, and like what really should be like the basic definition of saying is like, what is a strategy and what is something that is not a strategy?
Okay, so for me, I think a strategy is essentially a roadmap. Okay, um, in marketing, the fairly standard. It's been in all the textbooks since the 60s and probably before then, and will be for until the end of time. The basic is you look at the market, you work out where you can position yourself in that market. You work out who to target. Who's going to provide the best return. And then you work out how you're going to do it. So strategy is about defining those goals and then making a series of choices. It's a series of choices. Strategy is in
Mm.
terms of what you're going to do and what you're not going to do to achieve those goals, because and it helps you to focus your time, your resources, your messaging to give you a better chance of success. But in
Mm.
order for you to know what success is, you need to have defined it and worked out how you're going to get there. So that's why the roadmap analogy for me, I think, is one of the easiest ones to understand. It's not mine, but it's,
Mm.
if you're going to take a holiday, you're going to need to think about how you're going to get there and what you might need to pack and like how long it's going to take and all that sort of thing. And it's exactly the same in your business. That's what your
Mm.
strategy is. It's a roadmap that you're going to follow to help you try and achieve those goals.
When you're engaging particularly your clients, because it sounds like they very much fit into this camp, like for me, I know that when you immediately said that some people, when you ask them what their strategies is, like, oh yeah, well, we post on LinkedIn, and it's, oh well, where on earth do I begin to do that? And I'm trying to think up like examples, but like what are you finding is typical um the first time that you maybe engage with a client that needs this kind of strategic help in thinking about their marketing, and where, like, I'm almost thinking it was just like, what are some examples of how people kind of mentally get themselves stuck or get off the road, and somehow are like off in the weeds doing something that may sound strategic to them but doesn't make any sense to you.
Yeah. Okay. So in my experience, so just to go back like a step,
Mm.
in my experience, people will reach out and say, I need help with insert thing here, right?
Mm.
Um, and it's usually a tactic of some sort, okay? Because that's what marketing, they think marketing is, you know. And again, we keep using social media, but like,
Yep.
we need help posting on LinkedIn. We need help generating leads. We need help. We need to write an about us page for our website. Like it's normally a thing that is the prompt that makes them to come and say, can you help me with this thing? They very, very rarely say, I need a full strategy. in the people in the spaces that I work in, right?
Mm.
And I always think that it's actually really unhelpful because an awful lot of people go, actually, you don't need to do that. What you need is a strategy, and that always really bugs me because I'm like, that's supremely unhelpful. Yes, they do need a strategy. You know, you're not wrong, but what they need right now is some help with the thing because that's what's occupying their mind. And then when you've got them over that hurdle, you can go, do you know what would have made this an awful lot easier actually is if you got some strategic thinking about why you were doing that thing. You know, what was the purpose behind it? You know, so
You're giving me traumatic flashbacks. I think as a copywriter, most of my, or not most, a lot of my output, or the things that typically people might consider me for, are tactical.
yeah.
And I am often, this is often a point. So for my clients that do this, thank you very much for when I tell you this advice. But I'm often approached from a standpoint of, oh, we want to write a blog post, or we want to run a case study, or we
Yeah.
want a new landing page for this product. And it's starting that way is almost immediately stressful because the first question is always, why do you want to be doing that? How did you arrive at the conclusion that that was what you needed?
Mm-hmm.
And occasionally I will have the benefit of people who like, or brand or marketing specialists having done the work before me, and then I'm referred for it, and that's great because I'm usually start with like, this is what they're trying to accomplish, and this is how we ended up of, oh yeah, they want to be doing a series of white papers on X, Y, and Z topic. But it's often really difficult without that sort of knowledge, or somebody within the organization that's really active, of saying, oh, well, okay, so how did you end up here? How did you conclude that they want? And it's frightening how many times it's been like, oh, we just decided that this was going to be a really like cost effective way of us like getting our name out there. It's like, oh, that's, you
Yeah.
really don't really know. You're just thinking that like, if you produce something of a sufficient level of quality, that everything will just kind of work out for you. And
Mm-hmm.
it's difficult. You don't want to have to turn around and sort of work, like rule yourself out of work of then having to tell them, is like, as much as I would like to make a case study for you, I don't think it's going to help you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think for me, there's and this is one of the reasons why Happy Marketer is positioned in the way that it is, in the fact that we help with the thinking and then we help with some of the doing. Because for me, if you only focus on the thinking, so you could create like the most wonderful, beautiful strategy, and then find that you have no skills, experience, time, money to implement said strategy, which hopefully you would have considered during it. But let's say you've done some thinking and then you can't seem to get over the first hurdle, then you've got a problem, right? Sometimes, in order for people to figure out the direction that they're going in, part of that is through some doing. Because by doing some of the doing, so like, for example, writing a blog or a white paper or something, they can look back at it and go, you know, it would have actually been so much better if we'd aimed this at Fred rather than Bob. And that's when they start to realize that probably they need to do some more thinking about this,
Mm.
because that's going to refine what they do.
Yeah,
And they go hand in hand, right? You
yeah,
know?
yeah.
Um,
Absolutely. And this is, you're echoing, I think, the experience of at least a handful of clients I've had over the years that have lasted about 6 months with me, because that's the point where they start by saying, oh, well, we want this particularly hard written deliverable. And the point at which they begin to realize the lack of thinking that underpinned it beforehand. And then
mm,
there end up being a stall or an end, because I've done everything with the expectation that they kind of knew what they were doing, and they already had that plan in place.
mm,
And you were, or occasionally you'll probe, and I'll ask, how could this have been, what is the strategy? And they'll be like, all right, well, we've got this and this, and it's a lot of like, are you sure that you understand like what this is going to, because I sense that we're probably going to be coming back to this in 4 to 6 months. where you really, for the amount of money that you spend, you really do need to start getting results for the things that I produce for you.
Yes.
And uh, I can, it's very easy for me to produce a lot of content, uh, regardless of the quality level, that will do nothing because there isn't a strategic underpinning to the work.
Exactly. And I think this is one of the things, like one of the indicators, is quite often, that people will start to do whatever the things that they think are the right things to do. And then you start to then get a little bit further down the line and you're like, this isn't quite doing what I thought it would, and why is that?
Mm,
And then that's then a moment where you can actually be helpful and say, what you probably need is a more defined strategy, you
mm,
know, because depending on where they are, and I think particularly in B2B, this is just my observation, but I think particularly in B2B, I call it the written version of the telephone voice, right? But I think there's still this very much concept that I'm like, I'm working with a business, so therefore they will be businessy and they will have ticked all the business boxes, right? But it's the people running the business who are just normal people. And, I think we assume a certain level of, oh, they're bound to have this in place. And quite often they don't, because they'll have been focusing on something else, or maybe particularly from my perspective, because it's normally founder led businesses, they didn't found their business to suddenly become a marketing expert. They founded their business because they're dead into this particular engineering thing, or they've got an expertise in something that they've manufactured, and that they haven't got that in place because that's not their expertise, but I think you come in from an external thinking, oh yeah, they're bound to have like a big strategy and a business strategy and goals, and they go, no. They're actually, everyone I think is probably uh we assume, I think, because of what we know, that others who approach us will have a level of knowledge and understanding that actually they probably don't have.
right. And what do you find? How many people do you find come to you having been burned by that realization of that lack of understanding? And
So
what does that look like?
I think the people who come to me um, are smart cookies in the fact that they figured out that they don't know. What they don't understand is, it's that whole classic, they don't know what they don't know, right? As in, they know that they're not an expert in that area. um they're well aware that they probably reach the limitations of what they can probably do, and so they're very much like, now ultimately, even though I don't really want to get to know all of this, I know I need it. And part of the reason why quite often they approach me, I believe, is because I'm fairly straightforward. I very often will go like, it's just marketing. Like, nobody's died. Like, let's stop worrying about it quite so much. And that's where the whole simplifying thing comes in, because I'm like, you can write a strategy on one piece of paper. Like, it's not going to be all singing or dancing and have bells and whistles. But if you answer a certain number of questions, you will have the bones of a strategy. And sometimes that's enough to get people started, of like, oh, well, now you've put it like that, I get it. you know um and But I think they come to me going, I know this isn't probably what I need, but I don't know what I need, can you help me figure it out?
If you were to talk to somebody about figuring out what marketing strategy is really, what that roadmap looks like,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe this is long before someone might talk to someone like you or me, what do you think they should be thinking about?
Okay, so I think, we mentioned, didn't we, that really it's a series of choices. And so I'm quite pragmatic in the fact that I think whatever your strategy is, it should be, as part of your smart, it should be reasonable for you to feel like you can achieve this, right? So it's got to be something that's going to work with you and your business. So if you have half an hour a week to do the marketing in inverted commas, then your strategy is going to be something that's going to be fairly light touch because you haven't got hours and hours to put into it. And so the decisions that you make are going to be around, well, what is achievable in that time that's going to help the boat go faster, to use that horrible expression, but which are those things that you can think about, because ultimately you've got to have something that's pragmatic that you can do, as well as making the right choices about the direction that you're going in, or the tools that you choose, or the tactics that you decide to utilize as part of that strategy. So I think at the very least, before they start talking to somebody, I'd be looking at how much time do I have, how much money do I have, and am I willing to part with, crucially. Because just because you have it doesn't mean that you want to spend it. And also for you, what do you think success looks like, and therefore how much are you willing to put behind it, because that's all relative, isn't it? If you are in a position where you need some serious cash injection into your business, the strategy that you then create might be quite different to, like, actually, my cash pipeline is all right, but what I want to do is I want to grow the business long term, and so therefore I'm going to think about what I'm going to put aside or do for that. So I'd be looking at, in your business right now, what do you have, where are you going, and what's missing from that? What is it that you don't have that you think you need, right? Because then ultimately then you could come to somebody like us or anybody and go, this is where I think I'm going, I don't quite know how to get there, then can you help me? Because you've at least thought about that.
And certainly when you coming up with that, I can see that the main issue seems to be around establishing a realistic objective. Your strategy is nothing if it doesn't have a clear objective of what you're setting out to achieve.
Yeah.
I imagine that, and I find that in my experience, if your objective is only as vague as I want my business to make more money, that's probably not terribly helpful. So if you're working under very limited constraints, how would you go about helping a business owner decide this is a realistic expectation, a realistic objective based on that time and that money that you have available?
Yeah. Okay. So yes, it does hang around objectives, but obviously, we're not going to teach people to suck eggs in terms of what is a smart objective, but it does need to be a smart objective. And in marketing, I think one of the hardest things to get your head around in marketing is that it's not about you. So you might say, I want to sell 20,000 units of whatever the thing is that you want to sell. Well, that's great. I'd quite like to, be a millionaire, but it's not going to happen overnight, right? So that's where the roadmap piece is so important, because that's where you go back and you look at the market in which you're already in and what it's doing, how it's behaving, regardless of what your business does or sells, right? So you can understand that, then you can figure out where in that process your business fits, and can you define that better so that you can say, actually, we're not this and we're not that, but we are this, and we can speak to those people in that way, because then that will help you define what the objective is. But ultimately, in order to get you started, you need to have some idea of what it is that you want, because it's your business, so yeah, it's chicken and egg. But ultimately, it's not a case of, I'm going to tell you what I want, this is my objective, and you're going to get me there. That's not what we do. It's more, this is where I think I want to go. Can we sense check that? Is that actually possible? Is it realistic? Is it achievable? And then how the hell do we achieve it? That's what creating a strategy is. You have to sort of, I call it backwards proving, because, ultimately the business owner will know their industry pretty well. They know their customers pretty well. That's why they're doing well already. Yeah. So I'm like, it's not you don't know anything. It's more, let's take what you know and what you think, and let's stress test that to see whether we're going in the right direction.
And certainly on the copywriting side, occasionally when we're working on, well, we don't, if you've never put out a significant amount of copy or done a brand campaign or a lot of content marketing, we may not know what your core audience might respond to.
Mm.
In order to do that, the I would argue the fastest and cheapest way to do it is to run short experiments. We write something that we think might work,
Mm.
and we put that out there, and then we test and we see what feedback that we get. And
Yeah.
usually with content, you have to do this quite a lot in order to get a result. As in, if you create a single blog post is never going to produce anything of any real value unless you are like luckier than a leprechaun.
Yeah.
You have to do it, I would say, like 50 might be a good starting point, and I'm really just pulling that number out of the air.
Mm.
But it speaks to the kind of the scale of, if you don't know, then we want to find out quickly by trying lots of times in a relatively low risk environment until we can find something that resonates, that
Mm.
that produces some kind of positive outcome that we're looking for. And then we say, all right, well, now you should be looking at, maybe if you want to go from here, we can start creating a bigger investment and taking a bigger risk into that thing that we now can say people like that, or
Yes.
especially your customer likes that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that feeds back into the what I was saying about actually half of the half of the issue is not that there's no strategy. Half of the issue is that they're not doing anything anyway. So if there's nothing to get any feedback on, you've got nothing to feed into the eventual strategy because you're like, well, I don't know, and that feeds back into the I don't know what I don't know. You need to have that, and like, so let's say we take that arbitrary number of 50. So that's a blog a week in a year ish, right?
Mhm.
So that's actually an awful lot of resource and thinking time. And if you said to a business, right, you need a blog a week for a year, um, they probably couldn't think of 50 different things to say, and that's when people go, oh, I give up. Like, I can't do the marketing. Marketing doesn't work, and that's where the the strategy piece again comes in, because
Mhm.
then actually, if you know, or you think it's not actually that difficult to come up with 50 titles
Yeah.
because you've done that thinking already.
And for me, certainly when the strategy has been done well, it usually has come with, we have a couple of really strong positive indicators about what our customers are already interested in.
Mm.
And then that becomes immensely easy because now we have a starting point of saying, all right, well, we know that customers like this, this, and this. And we can just grow from there. You write about those on a basic level, and then usually in the process of producing that, you will come up with more ideas. So you don't need to
Mm.
come up with all 50 ideas right away.
No, no.
You maybe just need to come up with 20 or maybe even just 10. And by doing that, and again, by taking in some feedback, you can figure out where more things open up. And it opens up exponentially as you sort of move further and further in, because
Yeah,
at the end of the day, you could write about just about anything in any way that you want. The problem is not coming up with ideas. Often on my side of things, it's narrowing them down into a limited range that we can then focus our efforts on to make sure that we're effective.
yeah. And again, that's choices, isn't it? You
Yeah.
know,
So for the business owners, then,
yeah.
um, when they're sitting down and thinking, am I ready to start getting into the real nitty gritty of strategy for their marketing?
Mm.
What should they be looking at in themselves and in the state of the business to know now is the time is right?
Okay. I think indicators that you're ready to look at a strategy, I think there'll be little flags that will pop up, things that crop up regularly. one of them is that they know they probably need some marketing support, but they don't know what support they need. So they might have gone, actually, do you know what we could do with somebody doing the marketing, right? In the business. Like, I haven't got time to do these bits and pieces. It's, we're doing some stuff. It seems to be working. I need to bring somebody in. But then they sit down and they can't really define what that is. And that's when you get like those job descriptions that essentially is like moon on a stick, you know. Because why wouldn't it be ultimately? Because they're like, I need them to do all the things, right? That's often a good indicator that maybe you haven't done some thinking through what it is that you need most. It's not that you don't need the other things, it's that these are the ones that I need the most right now. These are my priorities, because that can help to define the sort of support that you might want to bring in, whether that's hiring or outsourcing or whatever it is. But that helps you to figure out what you're actually looking for. I think another indicator is you actually are doing lots of activity and you're putting your heart and soul into it, but it doesn't seem to be quite yielding the results that you thought you might get from it, but you don't know why. That's a point where you're like, I'm doing all this stuff and I'm churning all these things out and it all looks great, and I'm but at the end of the day, it's not really moving the needle. I'm not getting much more from it. It doesn't seem to be being effective, and I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. That would be a good moment to be strategy. And then the third one would be like, every time they sit down to do the marketing, they're not really sure which bit to focus on, and so they end up either spending half an hour going, what was it I was doing, and not doing it, or they find that maybe they've sat down to write a LinkedIn post and they can't really find the words, so they give up. That's another point when you're like, maybe I need a strategy, because if you've got that there, you would sit down and immediately think, right, I'm writing about this particular person, this is the problem that they have, this is the thing that we offer them, this is how I can help, blah blah blah, blah. Like it'll just come out because you've gone through it so many times in your head, and then all you've got to do is figure out whether you can write in a certain way or whatever. But then those three things I think are triggers for, I might be ready to have a conversation about what a strategy might look like.
And certainly, if you've ever, the other telling thing for those of us that are doing the more tactical work is it shows up in the brief as well, about like how clearly you define what it is that you want for us. Because if you say, I just want a blog post about a very general topic, that's actually really, it's a very difficult way to actually write, because oftentimes, because of our training and our background, I will look at a general topic and I can probably come up with an easy sort of, there's 10 different ways that we could come at that. A well strategized brief usually means that they have refined that down to, there's maybe 2-3 ways at most that we can go at that, and that becomes an easy conversation of writing back and saying, well, I noticed that you wanted to write about this specific thing and how it helps your customer when they're dealing with this very specific problem.
Yeah.
There's a couple ways that we could go about doing that. Which one would you like? And that's, I find that particularly people in management and executive love that, because when they're given a sort of an either or a very limited range of options, because it also helps. I find the way that it looks like from the copywriter standpoint is it helps them focus their thinking, and means that the feedback and the focus that you get from working with the client is 100% better. You are a better client when you are working under constraints.
Yeah. And I think another one to add into that's just popped into my head while you were talking is, so my background before I started Happy Marketer was I was often the marketer in a B2B business, right? So I wore all the hats. This is why I'm quite good at this. Like, I know what it's like to be like, oh, that comes under marketing. They can do this. But I think one of the trigger moments of kind of like, actually, maybe we need a strategy, is that when you go out and you commission something, whatever that might be, maybe it's a piece of copy, maybe it's you're talking about brand, maybe you want a new logo, or like you want a new website or whatever it is. And then whoever it is that brings that back and presents it to you, the people sat around the table in your business can't agree. Right?
Right.
because you haven't defined that strategy. Whereas, once you've all agreed that this is where you're focusing, this is who you're heading for, this is why you're doing that, even though they might not particularly like the style or they might not particularly like that color or whatever, they understand the process of this is why we're doing it this way. So if you keep getting something back and everybody keeps changing words or changing colors or whatever the thing is, and it's going, like people keep touching the same piece of paper like 8 times,
Mm-hmm.
chances are you don't have a strategy.
And they'll contradict each other in the
Yeah,
feedback.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's normally where you're like, perchance it would really help if you had this, But that's when, for you as a person within your business, that's a moment where you can go, maybe this is what's missing. Maybe I do need to do some work on this.
Sophie, if anybody wanted to get in touch with you or know a little bit more about the work that they did, where can they go?
Okay, so LinkedIn, you can find me on LinkedIn, Sophie Blackmore, or the company page is Happy Marketer. My website is happymarketer.co.uk. Those are the two best ways to get into contact with me. But if they're interested in anything that I've said and just want to find out a little bit more, I would just say come and find me and connect with me on LinkedIn, because I write regularly about how I work with people, more of this sort of conversation, and you can get involved there. The other thing you could always do as well is I send out a weekly email. I know most people don't particularly want any more emails in their inbox, but the feedback that I get from people who receive it is that they find it very, very helpful, because I do break things down into very quick, small, actionable points. That's the whole point of it. So if you're not quite ready for, I want to do the whole strategic piece, but I want to understand a little bit more about what I could be doing, that's a great place to start.
I will try to make sure that all the links for all of those things are in the show notes.
Awesome.
But yeah, otherwise, thank you very much for joining me. If you have any feedback for me or enjoyed this podcast, I would ask if you could leave me a like or drop a subscribe. And if you really feel compelled, you can send your feedback to my email, which is andrew@andrewmonroe.com. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.